Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our webinar this evening is going to cover planting strategies presented by, we'll go ahead and turn the screen over to Dr. Marissa Thompson to present on planting strategies. Marissa?
Well, thank you for the introduction and for hosting this entire series. My name is Marissa Thompson, and I'm based out of Las Lunas. I work for New Mexico State University Cooperative Extension. And so today we're talking mostly about container gardening, drainage issues. We're going to talk about drainage a lot because I think that for beginner gardeners, the biggest problems we have are things drying out and then overwatering and drainage issues. So it's this trick of trying to meet it in the middle and water enough, but not have soggy roots. Okay. So I'd just like to start out with some beautiful plants from around the state. Here's some big leaf maple leaves in the Manzano Mountains in October. And then we have winter coming on where we have all kinds of frost issues and freezing temperatures around the state. And then we've been tracking the blooming time of different fruit trees in Las Lunas. Here where I work at one of the NMSU research farms, we have apples, like this is a picture of apple blossoms. They're not quite in bloom yet. We need another couple weeks. But as of 2 days ago, we already had apricots in bloom. And then right after that, we expect plums and peaches and cherries and apples. So a lot of years, of course, we get the entire crop wiped out by a frost in April or even in May. So that's something that we are paying attention to. And if you're interested in that, we can talk about that some more. And then also there's the summer when we get to pick a lot of our fruit, but then also we can be growing vegetables throughout each of these seasons, depending on where you're at and what types of vegetables you are growing and what kind of microclimates you can create in your yard for protection. So with New Mexico State University, we have the county extension programs in every county across the state with also, so there are, we have 4-H programs and master gardener programs in different counties. We also have these 12 ag science centers. These are research farms where we can study, for example, fruit trees and how maybe if you have a new variety of apricot that's a late bloomer, we could plant it down in Artesia and up in Farmington and see how it does and compare, because we all know that the planting zones and the way the plants are responding in these different zones really varies so much depending on where you are in the state. So like I said, I'm based at the Ag Science Center that is in Las Lunas. So my program is the horticulture program, and I tend to focus more on landscape ornamentals and trees, and then also backyard fruits and vegetables. So my program is divided up into extension work, which is what we're doing today, outreach and education, and also I write gardening columns where I answer questions from the public, and then also research programs. So the research program that I've had going the last 4 summers, and we're going to continue this summer, is with tomatoes growing in Las Lunas. And we've been shading these tomatoes using a row cover cloth. It's also sold as a frost cloth. So you may have seen, it's like a real white, thin, almost like gauzy type cloth. And so we cover the tomato plants to cover the cages all the way to the ground. As soon as they're transplanted on day 1, get them covered and then keep them covered until the middle of July. And the benefits we've seen, and we haven't published these results yet, but other people have also shown that we may be really helping the plants avoid a common disease called curly top virus, where the tops of the plants, the tops of the tomato plants and chilies also will actually start curling and kind of turn purple. So the concept is that by keeping them covered with this row cloth, we are keeping this, the cloth is very fine knit. So we're keeping the leaf hopper insect off of the plants. And that's the insect that's known to transmit the virus through plants. And so at least last summer, the tomato plants that we were growing, the ones that were not in shade and that were just exposed to full sun, we lost 40% of those plants by the beginning of August. And the ones that were covered, we had only lost 4% of those plants by the beginning of August. So that's really encouraging data. And we hope to keep studying different types of shade, the length of time that you've had the shade on, to see if this is really helpful as far as this virus protection goes. But there are also other benefits of shade. So growing plants in shade is a really great idea. If you can shade or partially shade your plants, maybe it means planting so that plants aren't getting that late afternoon west sun, so they're getting some shade in the afternoon. You know, we see plants that say they're full sun, but we know after you plant them a couple times that those plants are often grown in, you know, Florida and California, where they get a lot of sun there, but we have more sunny days and less cloud cover on average. And we're also such a high altitude that the sun is much more intense here. So the question is, if we're growing plants in shade or partial shade, can we use less water, have less disease problems, less other types of stressors, and still have as good of a yield? So on the tomato study plants, we harvested over 5,000 pounds of tomatoes last year with volunteers. If you're interested in volunteering this summer, there are tomatoes that we get to take home, but not until later in the summer. Really, we harvested most of those, or all of them pretty much, in September and October. And so if you're interested in volunteering, you can reach out to me on social media. That's my social media handle, NM Desert Blooms, or also find me at that blog spot. And I think I'll put in the chat, if it's okay, Jesse, later, the link to that blog and a bunch of other links I'm going to recommend. So I also mentioned this column that I write. It's called Southwest Yard and Garden. And so I take questions from the public and then try to answer them. And here's an example of one. The question here was, is there an easy way to tell if a flower is wind pollinated or insect pollinated? And I think I have a picture of it. Oh no, maybe not. Well, anyway, there's another picture showing different flower types. And so I'll put the link in the chat if you want, if you're interested in finding the answer to this question. But I do accept questions from the public. And so you can send them to me, and then either I try to answer them or I find another specialist to answer them. And because this column has been written, I've been writing it for 4 or 5 years, but my predecessor wrote it for 22 years before me. So a lot of questions have already been answered, and I'll check back there, look through the archives, and see if I can find answers to your question that are local answers. So ideally, they're not questions that you could just Google and find. So we also sometimes offer workshops and tours, and so that's fun. This is me showing off how to use this pressure bomb. It's a device that we use to measure water status on plants. It's pretty interesting, and if we have time at the end, I'll come back in and talk about how that works. But the first thing I want to share with you is, as far as advice for your gardening, is really understanding better your growing zone and your frost dates and your precipitation. And maybe you already know that you're not going to get very much precipitation this year, but a lot of people are new to the area, and this can be a good resource for both. So I often use this website that I have here, plantmaps.com. If you go to that, you can enter in your zip code, and I'll show you what the data looks like. But to summarize what we're looking at here, this is looking at the plant hardiness zones for different parts of the state. So different colors represent a different zone. And I know that's really small print at the bottom, but I tried to, let me get my pointer here. Yeah, so I think that you can see here we have zone 4, for example, has a average annual low temperature, extreme low temperature of between -30 and -20 degrees Fahrenheit. So depending on what zone you're in, this is your winter cold temperature. This is not taking into effect how hot it is or how much rain you get. It's just dealing with cold. And so this is really important when you're planting perennial plants that you want to come back year after year. So the perennial plant will have on its label, or you can Google say you want to plant some type of mint, and you want to know, is this going to be hardy and come back every year? And so the answer is yes, it probably will. But you can look for the zone and see if the zone is, if some plants might be a zone 9, which means they can only stand it to between 20 and 30 degrees. But for most of the state, we get temperatures in the teens. And so it's the likelihood that that entire plant will die and not come back. So that's how you use that kind of data. But also I want to point out that whenever we're looking at data like this, it's crucial to think about when the data was collected. So this map is from 2012, which is already 10 years old. And if you look at the fine print down here, it shows that it's the data based on 1976 to 2005. So hopefully soon we'll get new updated maps, but basically this is already kind of old. And so it's not so simple with our climate change and the climate crisis that your area will just bump up into another zone, because we're still expected to get really cold temperatures, but we are seeing that the averages are definitely going up for cold temperatures and for high temperatures, more so for high. So if you were to enter your zip code, and I just picked a zip code from Roswell as an example. So I entered the zip code for Roswell at this plantmaps.com, and this is the screen that I saw. So this is showing me that Roswell is in zones A and B. And so this is, again, based on that older data. And so some little parts of the county are zone B, so it might be important to you depending on where you are within that zip code. But I also want to show you what other data they're sharing here. So I know that this is small, but down here it's showing the older hardiness zone. So remember, this data is from the 2012 set, but from 1990, this was a zone 6B, and now it's already gone up to 7A or 7B. So that's just demonstrating that it has changed over time. But also, this is showing the average first frost date for that same time window. And it's showing here that in the Roswell zip code, somebody might expect that their first frost will be sometime in middle October. And maybe even more importantly for our vegetable planting, the last frost on average is at the end of April in this particular area. So knowing what the average last frost is really, really helpful. I checked with a couple people to ask what is their best recommendation for new gardeners. And so the recommendations are that you should experiment and try different things, which is wonderful advice, and I want to encourage that. And it's really too early. Be careful, because a lot of the stores are already selling things like, if you were to buy a tomato plant now, in most of the state, if you were to plant it outside, you'd need to protect it. And I have some simple ways to do that through a couple more frosts. And if you're in an area that is in the central or northern part of the state, that means a lot of protection, and it can get pretty cumbersome. Whereas if you were to keep the plant inside, it's likely to get leggy and have some problems between now and when you can plant it outside. So it's still a little early for a lot of the warmer season vegetables. The colder season vegetables we can get into. So that's where you might find that kind of data. I also noticed that according to the data set from, it was 1979 to 2005, I guess, the average precipitation in this area of Roswell was over 14 inches. And I just know from speaking to people who lived there a couple of years ago, I guess it was 2 or 3 summers ago, they only got 5 inches all year long. So, and record-breaking heat, multiple weeks in a row that year. So sometimes the data is flawed and is older. So you use it as a guideline, but it's not always going to be exactly what we need. Okay. So what to plant now? So a couple years ago, I started with some of these as a trial. So here you can see I tried with some lettuces and kale and different radishes, microgreens. I have a picture of how some of those turned out. And I did have some great luck. So I actually was planting in containers. And so you may be planting in containers, you may be planting in the ground, maybe you have raised beds or you're making raised beds. One thing really important to keep in mind is that raised beds and containers are likely to really dry out a lot faster than in-ground planting. And we tend to have this idea that our soil isn't any good, but really a lot of these plants, not all of them, but a lot of these will handle our soil really well. And keeping up with the weeds may be the biggest problem. But as my friend Mike Halverson with Santa Ana Native Plant Nursery pointed out, with the raised beds and containers, you still get weeds. I had elm seeds, the weedy kind, growing in my containers. So weeds are going to be a problem no matter which method you use, but there are some benefits to in-ground that should take seriously. Also, the soil that you're putting in the containers is going to be important. So we'll get more into that, I think, in a minute. So I picked some different containers, and some I was reusing, and some I had gotten new. I like to mix plants. So you can see here's a little succulent. These are not vegetables. These are just little flowers I was trying. I'll put in different flowers throughout my veggie containers. And then here we have some bok choy growing. We also had radicchio that year and some lettuces. I was able to keep harvesting the lettuce through most of the summer. So that was pretty fun. And so you can see here, the soil is this rich, dark soil that has these little white granules in it that help with aeration and help it from getting too soggy for too long. So the big message is, and this is something I've tried because I was trying to get around it and it didn't work for me either, is that we should not be using our own soil from the ground in a container. And it seems counterintuitive, and I just really didn't want to believe it, because who wants to go buy this much planting soil? But the truth is that there's lots of different problems with doing this, but what happens is that and John Garlish gave a presentation earlier today on vegetable gardening, and he said the problem is that when you take soil from our yard and put it in a container, you're creating like adobe mud that can dry out and turn into adobe bricks. It's too dense and it gets too hard and too difficult for the plants to dry out. So we really recommend using a potting soil for your container gardening, because it's going to be better for drainage, really. And for raised beds, I know that gets really scary, because if you have a raised bed that is a couple feet high, how are you going to, filling all of that with soil is very expensive, really hard on your back, and it actually isn't needed. Most of the vegetables that we want to grow in our gardens need so for some of these greens, they only need maybe 6 or 10 inches of soil. For most vegetables, that will be okay, a foot maybe of soil. For something like carrots and beets that are growing down into the soil, a little bit deeper will be better, but still less than 2 feet, 18 inches. So you can fill the bottom of your container and then have soil with other things, with empty pots upside down, and then have the soil on top to help you not waste that space and accidentally get too much soil. So there is some concerns with that, and I'll get into more of that in a minute. So let's see. So for example, on the label, it might say that bok choy will take 45 to 60 days. But so depending on the variety, they should be ready to harvest. So that's 45 to 60 days after the seeds germinate. And I think that the take-home message is that they say that you can start harvesting at 45 to 60 days, but really much earlier. Even in this picture, I could have come in and picked some of these newer leaves. I wouldn't want to take the growing tip, right? That meristem is very important tissue, but I could collect some of the older leaves and put them in my salad, and then they will keep growing. And so for a lot of the lettuces, the greens, you can harvest earlier than that and just continually harvest as new leaves are coming from. And I'm going to talk about drainage a lot. So like I said, the biggest problem we have is that containers that we get from the store, or maybe that we're reusing, don't have holes in the bottoms. And so creating the holes or making sure that they have holes is part of ensuring that you're going to have enough drainage in your containers. we think about how plants need water to grow, and that's true, but they also need oxygen. Those are the two main things that plants need, water and oxygen. And so the tiny, tiny little root hairs that you can barely even see, those are the ones that are dry. Then the plant can't pull up water, and that's what makes the whole plant die. If the plant is too soggy, the root hairs rot off and die, and so again, can't absorb water. So that's why a lot of times the first symptom of your plant roots dying, it might be. So the best thing to do is to really stick your finger down into the soil inches before you water, and be sure that it's drying out down there, and that you're not watering a wet pot. If you see water pooling at the top, that's a hint that it's not coming out of the bottom. And so you can either try to amend that by putting more holes in. That's what you have to do. Or making sure that the hole's not blocked. It can get blocked sometimes. So that's going to be crucial. All right, so here's some kohlrabi that starts just coming up as little seedlings, and then tomatoes and also artichokes. These were growing a couple years ago in our greenhouse here at the farm. So this is just after a week or so after planting, and then we have an updated picture, and it looks like, there we go. This is by March 20th. So this is just a few weeks after they were growing. And so these are the tomatoes, and then here's the artichokes coming up. And so these are looking great. But I do want to point out, you can kind of see it. Maybe you have to have a bigger screen like me, but you can see this, barely this green coloring that is showing up on some of these. And if you were to look closer, you'd find that there's a green layer and that's showing up right on the dark soil, and that is algae forming, and it's a symptom of too much water. So so backing off and letting them dry out a little bit will help with that. So this is what they look like when you have a beautiful greenhouse and a regular watering system. If this was at my house, and I have some pictures to show you, it is really difficult for me to keep these plants watered and to keep enough sunlight on them from home. So after a couple weeks, though, in this greenhouse, the plants were big enough to plant, and so then we grew tomatoes, and that was the beginning of that tomato study. That was in 2019. So that was fun, and I got to come up with that tomato emoji, and yeah, so growing tomatoes can be really great from seed if you have enough light and you're watering appropriately. The temperatures are just right. So here's a picture of the inside of that greenhouse. So I know that a lot of us don't have a system like this at home, and I want to show you what happened when I tried really hard to do it right at my house, and I got these super leggy tomatoes that did not transplant very well, and a couple of them stayed alive, but it just wasn't enough light. So even in a south-facing window, in the brightest window in your house, it's not enough light to really grow these plants all the way up. So then what you might have to do is take the tray outside. You know, if these seeds were already sprouted now, I would be taking the tray outside and watering, be sure they don't dry out in the intense sun, and then at night bring them back in so that they don't freeze that night, and then keep doing that for several weeks. So like I said, it does get cumbersome, and I want to encourage you to experiment if you haven't already, but also warn you that it shows up like this, and so you end up buying transplants anyway. And that's okay. It's part of the learning process. A couple of little tidbits there, though, is that when you get a packet of some of them, you could plant maybe 20 of them in your planting soil, and then see how they do. And then after the last frost, also plant some from seed and see how they do, like direct seed them in your yard. And that way you're not relying completely on the seeds that you're growing, possibly indoors. If you do transplant and then you know you're going to get a freeze that night, you can do something like this. Is as simple, depending on how big your your scale is. I'm only talking about planting these single plants and then trying to keep them alive past the freeze. So I just used old containers and put the container on top to help it get through a couple of those nights where temperatures were going to get into the high 20s. And it did work. The plant stayed alive. But the important thing here is going to be pulling the container off in the daytime so it doesn't get too hot under there. And then if it freezes again the next day, putting it on again. So it does get difficult to protect these plants, but it can be worth it. So if you're only growing a couple, you could use something like this to help get through a night that's going to get too cold. Or you can wait until your last expected frost date to plant. All right, so I have this example. So you can do this, these are starting sprouts. So this is an example of where you actually don't have to plant. You can still get the nutrients and eat them. So you might see that there's, you can do this with broccoli seed, with kale, with alfalfa, with lentils, with sunflower seeds. And so there are recommendations on exactly what to do, but you're basically soaking the seeds for a couple hours in water, and then on a daily, and then you drain them or you strain it, all the water off, and then every day you pour water in, shake them a little bit, and drain off the water. Put some water in, shake them a little bit, and drain off the water. And you keep them out of the sun, and so the seeds sprout, and then you can actually eat those straight out of the jar. You can have several jars growing at the same time so that you can keep up with the new ones. If you don't rinse them with water every day, they will start to get moldy and start to rot in there. So you have to keep up with this one too. But this is also a way, if you have old seed packets and you're wondering if they're going to sprout, you can do something like this, or put them on a wet paper towel, a moist paper towel, and keep them in a Ziploc bag that has a little bit of air, lets a little air in, but doesn't dry out too fast, and see if they're going to sprout. So say these alfalfa seeds in the packet there were really old. I might not be sure if they're worth trying to grow in my yard, and so I would try this in the jar for maybe a couple seeds, 10 or 15 seeds, and if they sprout, then I know that the package is still good, and I can plant them in the in little grow pots or however I want to do with them. So this is an easy way to have sprouts at home, even if you have no place to plant them outdoors. And there are a lot of different species that are tasty as sprouts. So you can try that. Okay, we're going to talk more about drainage. So there is a myth of putting drainage material in the bottom of your container. So the myth is, add a layer of gravel or other coarse material, rocks or something else in the bottom of containers to improve drainage. And that is a myth. And I'm going to share with you the information that's from a colleague at Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott is with Washington State University. And so she shared this concept of trying to think differently about how we use drainage material in the bottom of a pot. So I had heard it before too. You put rocks in the bottom to improve drainage. So in our yard in Las Cruces years ago, before I knew this was not going to help, we had these big chunks of concrete that I didn't know what to do with. So we put them down in the holes underneath the fruit trees because we thought they would help with drainage, and it turns out that it doesn't. And so I'm going to try to explain why. So part of the issue is that water doesn't easily move from layers of fine textured material or to layers of more coarse texture. And so in this example, in this picture, we have a flask of water that is dripping onto a container that has different types of soil. It has sand on the bottom, and then it has a finer silt loam on the top. And so this is just an example of if you're going from something real fine like silt loam to sand, but you could also use this analogy and think about using gardening soil, and underneath might be rock, or potting soil and rock, or the soil in your yard and larger pieces underneath. And so what happens is that the water, so here's this interface. It's called the interface between the sand layer and this silt loam layer. So as the water is dripping, drip, 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 it's starting to soak up in this silt loam area, right? And so that looks normal and that looks good. The problem is that over time, as water is drip, drip, dripping, because the sand layer here is more coarse and it has larger air spaces between, that means that the water is actually building up in this finer section on the top. So again, imagine if you have gardening soil in a container, and then underneath it you have rock or gravel or something thicker textured, then your water is building up there in the top where the roots are, which could be okay. And then eventually, if you put enough water on, sure, some water starts to barely sink in, but it takes more time for this, and the roots are going to be soggier for a lot longer. So here's the summary showing the water starts dripping in. First, it starts to fill up that top silt layer before it breaks through down into the rock. And then later it starts to break through. And unfortunately, for a lot of plants, this time is where their roots have had too much water on the root hairs and they start to rot and the plants start to really get stressed out. So on the one hand, I recommended that if you have a really deep raised bed and you want to fill it, you could fill it with something larger. On the other hand, you're affecting the way that the soil on top is going to drain. So we really need to think about that. Sometimes people will put rocks down in the bottom of a container to weigh it down so that it doesn't shake too much. And that is true, and that does help, but it is also hindering that drainage. And so it's just really something to keep in mind. And then the more different the interface level, the above versus the below. So if you had really, really fine powdery soil and then clay soil, and then you had huge rocks down below, that's gonna, the more different they are, the more extreme it is. And so the water really stays in clay soil versus so it's going to be very difficult to have good drainage in that type of system. So the bottom line, when water's moving through a soil and it reaches that interface, that vertical interface between soil types, it stops moving. And so that's where you get your issue. I am going to have some time to go over different vegetables to start, and I have different resources to share with you. But I also wanted to talk about herbs generally. Herbs can grow really well in containers. And so here's some gorgeous looking mint growing in a huge container at the Albuquerque Biopark. Also, here's a flowering plant, so you can grow portulaca or other flowers and herbs together in containers. And so those do really well together. In my yard, you can barely even tell, this is from last year or from 2 years ago maybe. So I have some mint that keeps coming back year after year, and then also growing different types of sage, oregano, and they're coming back again year after year in these containers. So I really like to mix things together and see what comes back. So if you're just trying for the first time, herbs might be the way to go because they are they're good for containers. And one wonderful thing about containers is that if the spot is too hot for the plant, you can move the container to a little bit more of a shady spot and see if it does a little better, right? Or through the season, as the sun is moving, you might find the opposite. You might want to move your container into more sun as the sun is changing the direction in the sky through the summer. So those are some real good pros of containers. Also, if you have just a little patio area, you can grow a lot of herbs and other veggies in a small space. Yeah, and so that's a couple of good recommendations for that. I think right now what I'd like to do is switch over and show you some of these extension resources. So I'm going to move this around to a different part of the screen. And I think you'll be able to still see it. So somebody let me know if you can see now. This is this home vegetable gardening in New Mexico? Anybody?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I don't know how to get this smaller over here, but I don't want to see that thing. But basically, this is a publication, and we're just going to scroll through it so that you can use it. I'm going to place this in the chat right now. Let's see. Oh, good, we have some good questions too, so I'll try to get to those in a minute. Okay, so this is this extension guide by Dr. Stephanie Walker. She's a colleague, and I'm going to just zoom out and go page down, maybe. So there's all kinds of before you plant, what to know, how to prepare your soil, different types of soil to try, fertilizer, which I have a warning about fertilizer in my slides to go through. So, you know, in an hour presentation, we can't cover everything. So I just want to give you these resources. But one thing that's really good in this, I think you'll be able to see this on your own when you link to it. But this is a table, and I'm going to try to zoom in. This is showing when to plant cool season and warm season vegetables. So these plants in this list, this top list, are the hardy plants. It says plant these as soon as the ground can be worked in the spring, or you can plant them at the end of the summer for fall gardening. And so in here, broccoli, cabbage, turnips, onions, peas, radishes, all kinds of stuff that can be grown. It started in this, and the thing is that when you think about these, a lot of them have a real tart taste in their leaves. Not all of them, but a lot of them, like kale, for example, collards do, mustards do, and those little chemicals that are in the leaf actually act similar to an antifreeze. They help keep the leaf itself from freezing, and so these are ones that you could safely plant outdoors as soon as your soil is not frozen. So in most of the state, the soil isn't really going to freeze hard, but if you are in colder regions, you'll have to wait until after that. Or you could plant in containers, and so that's a workaround. If temperatures drop really low, like down into the teens or lower, then maybe covering the plants, or another really great thing about the containers is that you could pull them inside for a night or two to help them get through a really, really cold night. So then here's another group of them. So this is still cold season vegetables, but these are half hardy. So it says plant near the average date of the last killing frost, or plant them in the summer again for your fall garden. And so these are endive, cauliflower, lettuces, celery, potatoes, etc. And then these are warm season plants that you're going to need to wait a little longer: tomatoes, snap beans, sweet corn, black-eyed peas. And then there's another list of warm season vegetables that are very tender. So these ones, for example, watermelon, if you have your little watermelon sprouts come up and you get down close to freezing, you might have some damage on those plants. And so waiting as long as possible for those makes more sense. So I have another, let me just see if there's other. So here's, there's water properly, some information about how far apart to space them and where to put the plant. Here's something that's interesting, and I see these pictures all the time. It surprises me. Sometimes you'll see row crops of, for example, tomatoes, and there's a shallow portion of the bed in the actual row, and then the plants are actually planted on the tops, on the berms, and you think that is counterintuitive. Wouldn't you want to plant it down here so that it's getting as much moisture as possible? But many farmers and growers will tell you that they really know it's true that planting down here may mean death of their plants because of too much water. Because if the water stays on too long, you're more likely to get these different fungal pathogens and bacterial pathogens that then can kill the plant, or the plant just might not be able to draw up any water, like I said, because of the root hairs. So in this example, they're planting on the side of that so that there can still be some drainage. You could also plant in the top, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, but that's something that was surprising to me. So, okay, there's all kinds of other recommended varieties. So here's a nice huge list of what part you eat, how do you know if it's too early, how do you know when it's the right time to harvest, or if it's too late. And so this might be very helpful to you through the season. And then there's some specifics about each one. So here's something about garlic, which we often recommend planting closer to in the early fall. So a whole bunch on onions, and onions are interesting because onions can be planted. There are some winter, there's some fall, there's some spring, different kinds of onions. So like I said, we won't have time to go over this entire thing, but there's some salad greens, lots of recommendations in this publication. Okay, the other publication that is related, so this one is called Home Vegetable Gardening in New Mexico, and it's number 457. That gives you an indication of how many hundreds of these similar types of publications we have. And this is the website to go to. It's aces.nmsu.edu/pubs. I'll try to put that in the chat there too. And so, oops, that didn't show up as a link, but it's the beginning of the one before that. But the there are publications on recipes, on financial awareness and education. There's a lot on plants, on growing recommendations and things like that. So here's where to go to find them. And the ones that are on gardening will mostly be under horticulture. There's a section under this tab. You'll find also some under agriculture, or a lot under agriculture. And this is the other one. So this is 457, but if you go to 457B, you'll find another publication that is related. This one is Growing Zones, Recommended Crop Varieties, and Planting Harvesting Information. And I think you'll find this one really helpful. Depending on where you are, you can follow this guide to get some more advice. So this one is sharing the page 2 here is a map of the state. And what they've done is they're just saying that these are different number of frost-free days based on, or the date of last frost. And so if you're in area 1, it's the coldest area. Area 2, actually that's the other way around. Area 1 is the warmest area. So Las Cruces is down here in area 1. This blank or plain white area that's throughout kind of the center part of the state, including where I am in Las Lunas and Albuquerque, Santa Fe. This is zone 2, and then zone 3, this area with just higher elevation and also colder winters, shorter seasons, that is this area 3. And so that's first, so you see that, so 1, 2, or 3, think about where you are. And then this is the recommendation table of when to plant based on that area. So if you're in southern New Mexico and you're in area 1, this is the chart for you to look at. And so let's say just this first one, you want to plant asparagus. It looks like this black is indicating that you can plant asparagus seed starting in February. Whereas for, let's say you were to pick broccoli, and for broccoli, the recommendation, if you're in this area, would be that you could plant, the black, I have to look at the bottom here. The black is not for seed, it's for transplanting. So that's this portion, sorry about that. So this is start transplants inside or transplant them outside. And so for, what was the example I was going to give is broccoli. It's saying that you can start seed inside in January, February, and you can plant them outside in the southern part of the state at the end of February. Also, because broccoli can be grown as either because it's a cool season crop, so you can grow it either in the spring or in the fall. And so if you were to want to have a fall crop, you could seed it in June, July, or you could transplant it in July, August to have a fall crop of broccoli. So again, this is for area 1. This is the same information for area 2. So this one for broccoli is going to be just a little bit different, a little bit later. And then for area 3, that coldest region. And what it's saying here is that your broccoli is going to be really have only a 1 planting window for that colder region, because you're going to be planting so late, and your growing season is that much shorter. And I really want to point out again that even though we're looking at these dates and we're thinking about when the broccoli is going to be its biggest size and ready to harvest, But you can eat broccoli greens throughout the season. So it doesn't mean that you have to wait that entire time. So depending on the plant you're growing, if the leaves are edible, you could be harvesting small amounts earlier in the season and not have to wait that entire time. Okay, so if I scroll down a little faster, I also want to share this. So later in this document, and it's helpful if you're able to rotate it. This is where you're going to see, let's go back to broccoli again. Let's see. So in this example, they are recommending several different types of broccoli. These are varieties that have been shown to work well in New Mexico gardens. This is the number of days to harvest, 55, 68. Again, that's not taking into account that you could be nipping little flowers off, or excuse me, leaves off and eating them throughout the season. And then this is based on area 1, area 2, area 3, those recommended planting times, and other recommendations here. So the other recommendations are like how to plant them, the depth, the distance between them, the number of feet per row per person that you, in order to plant a vegetable garden for your family or for your community. The number of seeds or plants per 100-foot row. And also, if you do everything right and it turns out well, what your approximate yield might be as far as in pounds. So this, I think, is going to be a helpful document for you, and maybe you'll see better how to use it. So again, you're going to look at that first map and figure out what area you're on, and then go from there. Okay. So now I'm going to switch back to, oh, I think I already have it here. Let's see. I just close this. You'll be able to see my slides again. Okay, so we were talking about herbs. And I also would like to talk about Hoyas. So you might have heard of Hoyas, and Hoyas are an incredible way to be watering your plants if you don't have a timed drip system, or if you don't want to be watering every day by hand. The concept here is that you have an earthenware clay pot that is porous. And so porous means that the water can move across it, and that it, so if it's a glazed pot, then it won't allow water to move. But if it's porous, like this one, so it's unglazed, then it might be something you can use. You would plant that, so that's the container on the right, but then on the left and in the middle is showing what it looks like when it's buried in the ground, and then it has a little cute lid that you can put on top of it, or you can just use any old thing to invert a saucer or something to put on top of it. And so this is one way to water. And in this case, you're going to need to be putting planting your seeds or your vegetables really close around. So the drawback of Hoyas is that the amount of area that they can keep wet is not that big, and we want to do research on exactly how wide and how far out you can plant. But if you only have one Hoya and a big container or a big bed, it's not going to be enough. You're going to have several and plant right around close to it. So here we have another picture. So you might fill these Hoyas. So in this case, and I'll show you how to do this, this is a homemade Hoya. So what it is it's 2 of these really basic clay pots that are glued together, and I'll show you an image on that. And then it creates this vessel, and they're not glazed, so water can seep out. And then in this case, the person has put a drip emitter down in it so that it would fill up automatically, but you could also do it by hand. So yeah, so you would know how much time you have to put it on in order to get the Hoya filled. And then ideally you'd be able to back off and not water for several days before the Hoya dries out and the soil dries out, and then you can water again. So this can really help with watering efficiently. So one thing to think about here, though, is that if you don't have that top covered, you can get mosquitoes in there, and that could be a real problem. Other animals could get in there and get stuck. And so cover with screening, or you can reduce evaporation by putting a piece of rock, or like I just use an inverted clay lid, saucer on top of it to keep things out and to keep it covered. So here's how I did it at home. And I don't think this is going to be a video that works. Let's see, maybe. Doesn't look like. So I took some of these basic ones. Oh yeah, let's see, this might be a video. And I used silicone caulk I plugged the hole at the bottom of this one completely. And then I used silicone caulk to connect two together. And then I left the hole on the top of this one open so that you could apply water in there. And then I just, for the fun of it, looks like it's not going to play. I put it in a thing of water just to see how quickly, I filled it with water and saw how quickly the water soaked out into this container. And so this is maybe a couple hours later. And then some more pictures from the one in my yard. So the problem I found I was having is that, okay, in this example, if I'm filling this with water, right, and that's the same example here, by hand, that means I'm like holding it over there and trying to fill it with water, and it's taking a long time. And so I thought maybe by gluing a third one onto the top, then the water fills in here, drips down into the bottom one, and then it soaks into the soil around. And so after, I guess it was after 2 full seasons, maybe 3, I noticed that there was some bubbling happening when I was trying to fill it, and the silicone was breaking down. So the hole at the bottom was sticking, but this was a problem. And so I ended up having to redo this one. But here's another picture, and here's a link I'll put in the chat. If I can pull it up. Excuse me just a sec, let me find it. Well, can't quite copy from that. Let me just go get this real quick. This Hoya link. So on the left there, you can see that I filled that top one, and then I, in this case, all I did with the silicone is block that very bottom hole, and I didn't actually do the whole thing where I have several attached, right? So I'm just filling that, and then I take a saucer that's the right size and put it on top to keep water from evaporating or from toads from drowning in it or something, and then that worked for me. And so over time, sure enough, it soaks out into the soil. This soil gets sufficiently moist, and it worked for this container. So again, here's the link to go find more. And the videos that I was talking about, those are on that blog, so you can go see those. They're little dinky videos I made just to try to demonstrate. But does that make sense to y'all, that this is just a very, very simple homemade Hoya that is quicker to fill up with water by hand. And then you can kind of see the caulk down underneath here is keeping that from pouring out the bottom. So it just seeped out over a couple hours. Another thing to think about with Hoyas is that when you first plant your plants, the water that's coming out of the Hoya may not get out there quickly enough or far enough to really soak the seeds. So you might have to water in the beginning supplementally in order to get the plants really going. Okay, I wanted to give a warning about fertilizer and manure woes and really try to back off on fertilizer. These are examples a colleague of mine shared pictures, and this happened to me also, where I believe what happened here is that there was a type of, it said composted manure on the label, but it was really too high in nitrogen, so it's considered hot, and so your plants can die before, just a couple hours. And so really we have a lot of problems with manure that is not fully composted and is too rich, or adding fertilizer and making it too rich. And then a little tip about mulch. Mulching is great on your perennial plants to help the roots and help water maintain longer in the soil. So you can mulch with leaf litter, you can mulch with other materials, you can mulch with the plants themselves can just stay there as long as they're not diseased. If you have a disease problem, of course, take those leaves out and dispose of them properly. But otherwise, leave the leaves. That's why we call them leaves. You can use mulch in potted plants. It can be thicker or it can be lighter and easier like this, and they will really benefit. Controlling winter weeds and mulch can help with that. A thick layer of mulch over 4 inches can help with those annual weed seeds to keep weeds from growing. So that's a hint, but this particular weed is one that we know, this one we call London Rocket. It is edible, and so that's nice. You could just eat it, but by controlling it, you're helping out a lot if you're trying to grow tomatoes or chili, because remember I talked about that leaf hopper that infects plants with the curly top virus. The leaf hoppers are known to overwinter on weeds like, watch out for it. It's a reason to try to control weeds in the winter before you're planting. And this is what it looks like up close. I have a couple recommendations for you. If you're interested in learning a lot more about gardening, there's the Seed to Supper program. So this is the ICANN program through NMSU. And I did talk to Sally Cassidy earlier today. She said they're still accepting new people to start in April. So there's a couple different options, and the website there will help you get that. Let me find it for you. Seed to Supper. So they're offering this year some in-person classes at different places around the state. I think one is going to be Santa Fe, and I can't remember now if I think the other might be Alamogordo. But sometimes I get my facts wrong, so you'll have to check on that. But I'm going to put the link to how to sign up for this. So there's in-person classes, and it's all free, but there are also, they're called, let's see, like on your own time, you can watch the webinar, you can fill out, there's like materials that come with it that you can read about, you can use the materials, and so you can, it's at your own pace. That's what it's called. There's the Seed to Supper program, so you can either do the in-class ones or the at your own pace online ones. It's a great resource. And also I mentioned that John Garlish spoke earlier about veggie gardening. That program is called Ready, Set, Grow. And it's a gardening series that's on the third Wednesdays of each month at 3 p.m. I wanted to advertise our upcoming ones, so you can see we have home drip irrigation systems in April. Then we also have soil issues in May, shading your veggies in June. And we have the schedule all laid out for the entire year with great presentations. So here is the link to go find those. We also record those sessions like this one's being recorded today. So you could, even if you missed the one that was earlier today with John Garlish, a lot of more information on vegetable growing, you can, I haven't uploaded the link yet, but I'll do that probably tonight. And then you'll be able to go on there and watch the video for that. And there's all of the last year's sessions also about weed control and diseases, and more on container gardening and herbs and all kinds of good stuff. So with that, I think, I don't know if do we have time? How would you like to do questions, Jesse? I know I kind of running right up against our deadline, or maybe we're over even.
We can do questions now, and I've seen a couple of questions go through the chat box if you want to answer those, and then we can take some questions after. That would work.
Great, thank you. So let's see, I'm looking at the chat box, but it's not letting me, let's see. Okay. So is that Manat maybe, or Manat asked, do the zone temperatures, oh yeah, address wind chill? So no, wind chill can be a much bigger problem. And that's one reason that we have such an issue with our fruit trees and blossoms, is that the wind chill factor really exacerbates that. And so I actually don't know when they're getting that cold temperature data. Are they getting it from, a couple feet off the ground or 20 feet off the ground, or where that data is coming from? But that is a really good reason to know the different microclimates in your yard, and knowing that if things are really windy in a certain spot, to hold off there and try that maybe you would use that for a different purpose, or a different type of vegetable that could handle the wind. Great question. Yeah, so Julie said, I guess maybe she attended the John Garlish presentation earlier today about the difference between potting mix and potting soil. And so one of them is used for more for seed starting and does not have actual soil in it. It's soilless medium. And the other one has soil in it, and it's that black stuff. And so making sure which one you have. So if you're trying to start seeds, a lot of times people use the kind that has the soil in it, and that might be good, or they might use soilless growing mix. And so I have a link to that describes that a little bit better, of the different kinds. But I actually don't remember or what the texture is, but you're right. The soilless growing mix in your container that's for long term, or your vegetable beds, certainly. Thank you.
The Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project is a New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service initiative delivered in collaboration with the Ned College Land Grant Office and the Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment Program. The project is funded by USDA's Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers Program. Our field staff consists of myself and then also our field specialist, Mikkel Lantana. With our program, we have 3 goals, as you can see there on the screen. Number 1 is to improve the operations and profitability and sustainability of socially disadvantaged Navajo farmers and ranchers and veteran farmers and ranchers. Goal number 2 is to increase the Navajo farmers and ranchers' knowledge and use of USDA programs such as NRCS, FSA, rural development, and risk management programs and services of those and others resource providers. And then last but not least, increase the local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and healthy food by Navajo families and individuals. So